Chapter 1. And every sentence pronounced by a judge in the name of the sovereign people dwells the whole majesty of justice. The august character of that justice was brought home to Jerome Crainquebille, costermonger, when accused of having insulted a policeman. He appeared in the police court. Having taken his place in the dock, he beheld in the imposing sombre hall magistrate's clerk, lawyers in their robes, the usher wearing his chains, gendarmes, and, behind a rail, the bare heads of the silent spectators. He himself occupied a raised seat as if some sinister honor were conferred on the accused by his appearance before the magistrate, and at the end of the hall, between two assessors, sat President Bourrice. The palm leaves of an officer of the academy decorated his breast. Over the tribune were a bust representing the Republic of the Crucifix, as if to indicate that all laws divine and human were suspended over Crainquebille's head. Such symbols naturally inspired him with terror. Not being gifted with a philosophic mind, he did not inquire the meaning of the bust and the crucifix. He did not ask how far Jesus and the symbolic bust harmonized in the law courts. Nevertheless, he was matter for reflection, for, after all, pontifical teaching and canon law are in many good points opposed to the Constitution of the Republic and to the civil code. So far as we know, the decretals have not been abolished. Today, as formerly, the Church of Christ teaches that only those powers are lawful to which it has given its sanction. Now, the French Republic claims to be independent of pontifical power. Crainquebille might reasonably say, gentlemen and magistrates, insomuch as President Lobe has been anointed, the Christ whose image is suspended over your heads repudiates you through the voice of councils and popes. Either he is here to remind you of the rights of the church, which invalidates yours, or his presence has no rational signification. Whereupon President Bourrice might reply, Prisoner Crainquebille, the kings of France have always quarreled with the Pope. Guillaume de Nogaret was excommunicated, but for so trifling a reason he did not resign his office. The Christ of the Tribune is not the Christ of Gregory VII or Boniface VIII. He is, if you will, the Christ of the Gospels, who knew not a one word of canon law and never heard of the holy decretals. Then Crainquebille might not without reason have answered, the Christ of the Gospels was an agitator. Moreover, he was the victim of a sentence which for 1900 years all Christian people have regarded as a grave judicial error. I defy you, Monsieur le Presidente, to condemn me and his name to so much as 48 hours of imprisonment. But Crainquebille did not indulge in any considerations, either historical, political, or social. He was wrapped in amazement. All the ceremonial with which he was surrounded impressed him with a very lofty idea of justice. Filled with reverence, overcome with terror, he was ready to submit to the judges in the matter of guilt. In his own conscience, he was convinced of his innocence. But he felt how insignificant is this conscience of the costermonger in the face of the panoply of the law and the ministers of public prosecution. Already his lawyer had half persuaded him that he was not innocent. A summary and hasty examination had brought out the charges under which he labored. Chapter 2. Crainquebille's misadventure. Up and down the town went Jerome Crainquebille, costermonger, pushing his barrow before him and crying, cabbages, turnips, carrots. When he had leeks, he cried, asparagus, for leeks are the asparagus of the poor. Now it happened that on October 20th at noon, as he was going down the Rue Montmartre, there came out of her shop the shoemaker's wife, Madame Bayard. He went up to Crainquebille's barrow, and, scornfully taken upon a bundle of leeks, she said, I don't think much of your leeks. What do you want a bundle? 7 pence halfpenny, ma'am. And the best in the market, 7 pence halfpenny for 3 wretched leeks? And disdainfully she cast the leeks back into the barrel. Then it was that the Constable 64 came and said to Crainquebille to move on. Moving on was what Crainquebille had been doing from morning till evening for 50 years. Such an order seemed right to him and perfectly in accordance with the nature of things. Quite prepared to obey, he urged his customer to take what she wanted. You must give time to choose, she retorted sharply. Then she felt all the bundles of leeks all over again. Finally, she selected the one she thought was best and knelt it clasped to her bosom as saints in church pictures hold the palm of victories. I will give you 7 pence. That's quite enough, and I'll have to fetch it from the shop, and I haven't anything with me. Still embracing the leeks, she went back into the shop, whither she had been preceded by a customer carrying a child. Just at that moment, Constable 64 said to Crainquebille for the second time, "Move on." "I'm waiting for my money," replied Crainquebille. "I'm not telling you to wait for your money. I'm telling you to move on," retorted the constable grimly. Meanwhile, the shoemaker's wife in her shop was fitting blue slippers on a child of 18 months whose mother was in a hurry, and the green heads of the leeks were lying on the counter. For the half-century that he had been pushing his barrow through the streets, Crainquebille had been learning respect for authority, but now his position was a peculiar one. He was torn asunder between what was his due and what was his duty. He was not a judicial mind. He failed to understand the possession of an individual's rights in any way exonerated him from the performance of a social duty. He attached too great importance to his claim to receive 7 pence and too little to the duty of pushing his barrow and moving on. For every moving on, he stood still. For the third time, Constable 64 quietly and calmly ordered him to move on. Unlike Inspector Montelciel, whose habit is to threaten constantly, but never to take proceedings, Constable 64 is slow to threaten and quick to act. Such is his character. Though somewhat sly, he is an excellent servant and loyal soldier. He is as brave as a lion, as gentle as a child. He knows not save his official instructions. Don't you understand when I tell you to move on? To Crainquebille's mind, his reason for standing was too weighty for him to consider it sufficient. Therefore, artlessly and simply he explained, "Good Lord, don't I tell you that I am waiting for my money?" Constable 64 merely replied, "Do you want me to summons you? If you do, you have only to say so." At these words, Crainquebille slowly shrugged his shoulders and looked sadly at the constable, and then shrugged his eyes to heaven as if he would say, "I call to God to witness. I am a lawbreaker. I am one to make light of the bylaws and ordinances which regulate my ambulatory calling. At 5 o'clock in the morning, I was at the market, since 7 pushing my barrow and wearing my hands to the bone. I have been crying cabbages, turnips, carrots. I am turning 60. I am worn out. And you ask me whether I have raised the black flag of rebellion? You are mocking me, and your joking is cruel." Either because he failed to notice the expression on Crainquebille's face, or because he considered it no excuse for disobedience, the constable inquired curtly and roughly whether he had been misunderstood. Now, just that moment, the block of traffic in the Rue Montmartre was at its worst. Carriages, drays, carts, omnibus trucks, jammed one against the other, seemed indissoluble, welded together. From the quivering immobility proceeded shouts and oaths. Cabmen and butchers, boys grandiloquent and drawling, insulting one another from a distance, and omnibus conductors regarding Crainquebille as the cause of the block, called him a dirty leak. Meanwhile, on the pavement, the curious were crowded around to listen to the dispute. Then the constable, finding himself the center of attention, began to think it time to display his authority. "Very well," he said, taking a stumpy pencil and greasy notebook from his pocket. Crainquebille persisted in his idea, obedient to force within. "Besides, it is now impossible for either to move on or draw back. The wheel of the barrow was unfortunately caught in that of the milkman's cart. Tearing his hair beneath his cap, he cried, "But don't I tell you? I'm waiting for my money. Here's a fix. Miserere de miserere, bon sang de sang." By these words, expressive rather than despair than of rebellion, Constable 64 considered he had been insulted, and because of this, mind all insults must necessarily take the consecrated, regular, traditional, liturgical, ritual form, so to speak, of mort de vaches. Thus, the offender's words were heard and understood by the constable. "Ah, you said mort de vaches. Very good. Come along." Stupefied with amazement and distress, Crainquebille opened his great rheumy eyes and gazed at Constable 64, with a broken voice proceeding now from the top of his head and now from the heels of his boots. He cried, with his arms folded over his blue blouse, "I said, mort à vaches. Oh?" The tradesmen and errand boys held the arrest with laughter. It gratified the taste of all crowds for violent and ignoble spectacles. But there was one serious person who was pushing his way through the throng. He was a sad-looking old man, dressed in black, wearing a high hat. He went up to the constable and said to him in a low voice, very gently and firmly, "You are mistaken. This man did not insult you." "Mind your own business," replied the policeman, but without threatening, for he was speaking to a man who was well dressed. The old man insisted calmly and tenaciously, and the policeman ordered him to make his declaration to the police commissioner. Meanwhile, Crainquebille was explaining, "Then I did say, mort à vaches. Oh!" And he was thus giving vent to the astonishment. Madame Bayard, the shoemaker's wife, came to him with 7 pence in her hand. The Constable 64 already had him by the collar, so Madame Bayard, thinking that no debt could be due to a man who was being taken to the police station, put her 7 pence into her apron pocket. Then, suddenly beholding his barrow confiscated, his liberty lost, a gulf opening beneath him, and the sky overcast, Crainquebille murmured, "It can't be helped." Before the commissioner, the old gentleman declared that he had been hindered on his way back by the block in the traffic, and so had witnessed the incident. He maintained that the policeman had not been insulted, and that he was laboring under a delusion. He gave his name and profession: Dr. David Mathieu, chief physician at the Ambrose Paris Hospital, officer of the Legion of Honor. At another time, such evidence would have been sufficient for the commissioner, but just the men of science were regarded with suspicion in France. Crainquebille continued under the arrest. He passed the night in the lockup, and in the morning he was taken to the police court in the prison van. He did not find prison either sad or humiliating. It seemed to him necessary. What struck him as he entered was the cleanliness of the walls and of the brick floor. Well, for a clean place, yes, it is a clean place. You might eat off the floor. When he did, left alone, he wanted to draw out his stool, but he perceived that it was fastened to the wall. He expressed his surprise out loud. "That's a queer idea. Now there's a thing. I should never have thought of that, I'm sure." Having sat down, he twiddled his thumbs and remained wrapped in amazement. The silence and the solitude overwhelmed him. The time seemed long. Anxiously, he thought of his barrow, which had been confiscated, with its loads of cabbage, carrots, celery, dandelion, and corn salad. And he wondered, asking himself with alarm, what had they done with my barrow? On the third day he received a visit from his lawyer, Maître Lemieux, one of the youngest members of the Paris bar, president of the section of La Ligue de la Patrie Française. Crainquebille endeavored to tell him his story, but it was not easy, for he was not accustomed to conversation. With a little bit of help, he might have perhaps succeeded, but his lawyer shook his head doubtfully at everything he said, and turning over his papers, muttered, I don't find anything about all of this in my brief." Then, in a bored tone, twirling his fair mustache, he said, "In your own interest, it would be advisable, perhaps, for you to confess. Your persistence in absolute denial seems to be extremely unwise." And for the moment, Crainquebille would have made confession if he had known what to confess. Chapter 3. Crainquebille before the magistrates. President Bourrice devoted 6 whole minutes to the examination of Crainquebille. An examination would have been more enlightening if the accused had replied to the questions asked him, but Crainquebille was unaccustomed to discussion, and in such company his lips were sealed by reverence and fear. So he was silent, and the president answered his own questions. His replies were staggering. He concluded, "Finally, you admit having said, 'Mort à vaches'?" "I said, 'Mort à vaches,' because the policeman said, 'Mort à vaches,' and then I said, 'Mort à vaches.'" He meant that, being overwhelmed by the most unexpected accusations, he had, in his amazement, merely repeated the curious words falsely attributed to him, and which he had certainly never pronounced. He had said, "Mort à vaches." He, as he might have said, "I am capable of insulting anyone." How could you believe it? President Bourrice put a different interpretation on the incident. "Do you maintain," he said, "that the police was himself the first to utter the exclamation?" Crainquebille gave up trying to explain. It was too difficult. "You do not persist in your statement that you are quite right," said the president, and he had the witness called. Constable 64, by name Bastien Martera, swore he spoke the truth and nothing but the truth. Then he gave evidence in the following terms. "I was on my beat on October 20th at noon when I noticed in the Rue Montmartre a person who appeared to be Hawker unduly blocking the traffic with his barrel opposite, number 328. 3 times I intimated to him the order to move on, and he refused to comply, and when I gave him warning that I was about to charge him, he retorted by crying, 'Mort à vaches,' which I took as an insult." This evidence, delivered in a firm and moderate manner, the magistrates received with obvious approbation. The witnesses for the defense were Madame Bayard, shoemaker's wife, and Dr. David Mathieu, chief physician to the hospital, Ambrose Paris, officer of the Legion of Honor. Madame Bayard had seen nothing and heard nothing. Dr. Mathieu was in the crowd which had gathered around the policeman, who was ordering the costermonger to be moved on. The evidence led to the new episode in the trial. "I witnessed the incident," he said. "I observed that the constable had made a mistake. He had not been insulted. I went up to him and called his attention to the fact. The officer insisted on arresting the costermonger and told him to follow him to the commissioner of the police. This I did. Before the commissioner, I repeated my declaration." "You may sit down," said the president. "Usher, recall witness Martre." "Martre, when you proceeded to the arrest and it was accused, did you not see Dr. Mathieu point out to you that you were mistaken?" "That is what Monsieur le Président, that he insulted me." "What did he say?" "He said, 'Mort à vaches.'" Uproarious laughter arose from the audience. "You may withdraw," said the president hurriedly, and he warned the public that if such unseemly demonstrations occurred again, he would clear the court. Meanwhile, counsel for the defense was haughtily sputtering the sleeves of his gown, and for the moment it was thought that Crainquebille would be acquitted. Order having been restored, Maître Lemaitre rose and opened his pleading with a eulogy of policemen. Those unassuming servants of society who, in return for a trifling salary, endure fatigue and brave incessant danger with daily heroism. They were soldiers once, and soldiers they remain. Soldiers, that word expresses everything. From this consideration, Maître Lemaitre went on to dissent eloquently on the military virtues. He was one of those, he said, who would not allow a finger to be laid on the army, on that national army to which he was so proud to belong. The president bowed. Maître Lemaitre happened to be lieutenant in the reserves. He was also a nationalist, candidate for les vieilles retraites. He continued, "No, indeed, I do not esteem lightly the invaluable services unassumingly rendered, which the valiant people of Paris receive daily from the guardians of the peace. And I beheld in Crainquebille, gentlemen, one who had insulted an ex-soldier. I should never have consented to represent him before you. My client is accused of having said mort à vaches. The meaning of such an expression is clear. If you consult le Dictionnaire de la Langue, you will find vaillard, a sluggard, an idler, one who stretches himself out lazily like a cow instead of working. Vache, one who sells himself to the police, or a spy. Mort à vache is an expression employed by certain people, but the question resolves itself in this: how did Crainquebille say it? And further, did he say it at all? Permit me to doubt it, gentlemen. I do suspect Constable Martre of an evil intention, but as we have said, his calling is arduous. He is sometimes harassed, fatigued, overdone. In such conditions, he may have suffered from an oral hallucination. And when he comes to tell you, gentlemen, that Dr. David Mathieu, officer of the Legion of Honor, the chief physician of the Ambrose Paris Hospital, a gentleman and prince of science, cried, mort à vaches, then we are forced to believe that Martre is obsessed and, if the term be not too strong, suffering from the mania of persecution. And even if Crainquebille did cry mort à vaches, it remains to be proved whether such words on his lips can be regarded as an offense. Crainquebille is natural child of the costermonger, deprived by many years of drinking and over evil courses. Crainquebille was born an alcoholic. You behold him brutalized by 60 years of poverty. Gentlemen, you must conclude that he is irresponsible. Maitre le Merlier sat down. Then President Bourrice muttered a sentence condemning Jerome Crainquebille to pay 50 francs fine and go to the prison for a fortnight. The magistrates convicted him on the strength of the evidence given by Constable Martre. After he was being taken down the long passage of the Palais, Crainquebille felt an intense desire for sympathy. He turned to the municipal guard, who was his escort, and called him 3 times. "See Paul, eh, see Paul," and he sighed. If anyone had told me only a fortnight ago that this would happen, then he reflected, they speak too quickly. And gentlemen, they speak well, but they speak too quickly. You can't make them understand. See, Paul, don't you think they speak too quickly? But the soldier marched straight on without replying or turning his head. Crainquebille asked himself, why don't you answer me? The soldier was silent, and Crainquebille said bitterly, you would speak to a dog? Why not to me? Do you never open your mouth? Is it because your breath is foul? Chapter 4. An apology for President Bourrice. After the sentence had been pronounced, several members of the audience and 2 or 3 lawyers left the hall. The clerk was already calling in another case. Those who went out did not reflect on Crainquebille's affair, which did not greatly interest them, and they thought no more about Monsieur Jean Lemaitre, the etcher, who happened to be at the Palais, and the only one who mediated on what he had just seen and heard. Putting his arm on the shoulder of Maître José Aubray, he said, President Bourrice must be congratulated on having kept his mind free from idle curiosity and from the intellectual pride which is determined to know everything. If he had weighed one against the other, the contradictory evidence of Constable Martre and Dr. David Mathieu, the magistrate would have adopted a course leading to nothing but doubt and uncertainty. The method of examining facts in a critical spirit would be fatal to the administration of justice. If the judge were so imprudent as to follow that method, his sentences would depend on his personal sagacity, of which he has generally no very great store, and on human infirmity, which is universal. Where can you find this criterion? I cannot be denied the historical method is absolutely incapable of providing him with the certainty he needs. In this connection, you may recall a story told by Sir Walter Raleigh. One day when Raleigh, a prisoner of the Tower of London, was working, as was his wont, at the second part of the history of the world, there was a scuffle under his window. He went and looked at the brawlers, and when he returned to his work, he thought that he had observed them very carefully. But on the morrow, have related to the incident to one of his friends who had witnessed the affair and had even taken part in it, he was contradicted by his friend on every point. Reflecting, therefore, that if he were mistaken as to the events which passed beneath his very eyes, how much greater must he be difficulty of ascertaining the truth concerning events far distant. He threw the manuscript of his history into the fire. If the judge had the same scruples as Sir Walter Raleigh, they would have thrown all their notes into the fire. But they have no right to do so. They would thus be flouting justice. They would be committing crime. We may despair of knowing, and he must not despair of judging. Those who demand that sentences pronounced in law courts should be found upon methodical examination of facts are dangerous sophists and perfidious enemies of the justice, both civil and military. President Bourrice has too judicial a mind to permit his sentences to depend on reason and knowledge, the conclusions of which are eternally open to the question. He found them on dogma and molds them from tradition so that the authority of his sentences are equal to that of the Church's commandments. His sentences are indeed canonical. I mean that he derives them from a certain number of sacred canons. See, for example, how he classifies evidence, not according to the uncertain and deceptive qualities of appearances and of human veracity, but according to intrinsic, permanent, and manifested qualities. He weighs them in the scale, using weapons of war for weights. Can anything be once simpler and wiser? Irrefutably for him is the evidence of a guardian of the peace. Once his humanity be abstracted and be conceived as a registered number, and according to the categories of an ideal police, not that Maitre Bastien, born at Cinto Monte in Bourrice, appeared to him incapable of error. He never thought that Bastien Maitre was gifted with any great faculty of observation, nor that he had applied any secrets and vigorous method to the examination of facts. In truth, it is not Bastien Maitre. He is considered Constable 64. A man is fallible, he thinks. Peter and Paul may be mistaken. Descartes and Gassendi, Labince and Newton, Bachiche and Claude Bernard were capable of error. We may all err at that moment. The causes of error are innumerable. The perceptions of our senses and the judgment of our minds are sources of illusion and causes of uncertainty. We dare not rely on the evidence of single man, but we may have faith in a number. Bastien Maitre of Cinto Monte is fallible, but Constable 64, when abstraction has been made of his humanity, cannot err. He is an entity. An entity has nothing in common with a man. It is free from all the confuses, corrupts, and deceives men. It is pure, unchangeable, unalloyed. Wherefore the magistrates did not hesitate to reject the evidence of a mere man, Dr. David Mathieu, and to admit that Constable 64, who is the pure idea in a man nation with divinity, come down to the judgment bar. By following such a line of argument, President Bourrice attains to a kind of infallibility, the only kind to which a magistrate may aspire. When the man who bears witness is armed with a sword, it is the sword's evidence that must be listened to, not the man. The man is incontemptible and may be wrong. The sword is not contemptible and is always right. President Bourrice has seen deeply into the spirits of the law. Society rests on force. Force must be respected as the august foundation of society. Justice is the administration of force. President Bourrice knows that Constable 64 is an integral part of the government. The government is eminent in each of its officers. To slight the authority of Constable 64 is to weaken the state. To eat the leaves of an artichoke is to eat the artichoke. As Stewart puts it in his sublime language, politique terre de écriture saint passim. All the words of the state are turned in the same direction. To oppose one of the other is to overthrow the republic. For some reason, Crainquebille, the accused, is justly condemned to a fortnight in prison and a fine of 50 francs on the evidence of Constable 64. I seem to hear President Bourrice himself explaining the high and noble considerations which inspired his sentence. I seem to hear him saying, I judge this person according to the evidence of Constable 64 because Constable 64 is the emanation of public force. And if you wish to prove my wisdom, imagine the consequences, and I adopted the opposite course. You will see at once that it would have been absurd. For if my judgments were in opposition to force, they would never be executed. Notice, gentlemen, that judges are only obeyed when force is on their side. A judge without policemen would be but an idle dreamer. I should be doing myself an injury if I admitted a policeman to be in the wrong. Moreover, the very spirit of the law is in opposition to my doing so. To disarm the strong and to arm the weak would be to subvert the social order, which is my duty to preserve. Justice is the sanction of established injustice. Was justice ever seen to oppose conquerors and usurpers? When an unlawful power arises, justice is only to recognize it and become lawful. Form is everything, and between crime and innocent, there is but the thickness of a piece of stamped paper. It is for you, Crainquebille, to be the strongest. If, after having cried, mort à fascistes, he has declared yourself emperor, dictator, president of the republic, or even town councillor, I assure you, you would not have been sentenced to pass a fortnight in prison and to pay a fine of 50 francs. I should have acquitted you. You may be sure of that. Such would have doubtless been the words of President Bourrice, for he has a judicial mind, and he knows that a magistrate owes to society with an order and regularity. He defends social principles. Justice is social. Only wrong-headed persons would make justice out to be human and reasonable. Justice is administered upon fixed rules, not in obedience to physical emotions and flashes of intelligence. Above all, things do not ask justice to be just. It has no need to be just, since it is justice, and might even say that the idea of just justice can have only arisen in the brains of an anarchist. True, President Magnod pronounces just sentences, but if they are reversed, what is still justice? The true judge weighs his evidence with weights that are weapons. So it was in the Crainquebille affair and other more famous cases. Thus, said Monsieur Jean Lemaitre, as he paced up and down the Salle des Pas-Barus, scratched the tip of the nose, Maître Joseph Aubray, who knows the Palais well, replied, if you want to hear what I think, I don't believe that President Bourrice rose to so lofty a metaphysical plane. In my opinion, when he received as true the evidence of Constable 64, he merely acted according to precedent. Imitation lies at the foot of most human actions. A respectable person is one who conforms to custom, people who are called good when they do as others do. Chapter 5. Crainquebille submits to the laws of the Republic. Having been taken back to the prison, Crainquebille sat down on his chained stool, filled with astonishment and admiration. He himself was not quite sure whether the magistrates were mistaken. The tribunal had concealed its essential weakness beneath the majesty of form. He could not believe that he was in the right, as against magistrates whose reasons he had not understood. It was impossible for him to conceive that anything could go wrong in so elaborate a ceremony, for unaccustomed to attending mass or frequenting the Elysee, he had never in his life witnessed anything so grand as the police court trial. He was perfectly aware that he had never cried mort à fasciste, that for having said he should have been sentenced to a fortnight imprisonment seemed to him an august mystery, one of the articles of the faith to which believers adhere without understanding them, an obscure, striking, adorable, and terrible revelation. The poor man believed himself guilty of having mystically offended Constable 64, just as the little boy, learning in his first catechisms, believes himself guilty of Eve's sin. His sentence had taught him that he had cried mort à fasciste. He must, therefore, have cried mort à fasciste in some mysterious manner unknown to himself. He was transported into a supernatural world. His trial was his apocalypse. If he had no very clear idea of the offense, his idea of the penalty was still less clear. His sentence appeared to him a solely insuperior ritual, somewhat dazzling and incomprehensible, which is not to be discussed and for which one is neither to be praised or pitied. If at that moment he had seen President Bourrice with white wings and a halo round his forehead coming down through a hole in the ceiling, he would not have been surprised at this new manifestation of judicial glory. He would have said, "This is my trial continuing." On the next day his lawyer visited him. "Well, my good fellow, things aren't as so bad after all. Don't be discouraged. A fortnight is soon over. We have not much to complain of. As for that, I must see the gentlemen were very kind and very polite, not a single rude word. I shouldn't have believed it. And the Cipoll was wearing white gloves. Did you notice? Everything considered, we did quite well to confess." "Perhaps. Crainquebille, I have a piece of good news for you. A charitable person whose interest I have elicited on your behalf gave me 50 francs for you. The sum will be used to pay your fine. When will you give me the money?" "It will be paid to the clerk's office. You don't need to be troubled about that." "It does not matter. All the same, I am very grateful to this person." And Crainquebille murmured meditatively, "It's something out of the common that's happening to me." "Don't exaggerate, Crainquebille. Your case is by no means rare. Far from it. You couldn't tell me where they've put my barrow." Chapter 6. Crainquebille in the light of public opinion. After his discharge from prison, Crainquebille trundled his barrow along the Rue Montmartre, crying cabbage, turnips, carrots. He was neither ashamed nor proud of his adventure. The memory of it was not painful. He classed it in his mind with dreams, travels, and plays. But, above all things, he was glad to be walking in the mud along the paved street and to see overhead the rainy skies of the town. At every corner he stopped to have a drink, then gay and unconstrained, spitting in his hand in order to moisten his horny palms, he would seize the shafts and push on the barrow. Meanwhile, a flight of sparrows, as poor as early as he, seeking their livelihood in the road, flew off to the sound of his familiar cry: cabbages, turnips, carrots. An old housewife who had come up said to him as she felt his celery, "What happened to you, Padre Crainquebille? We haven't seen you for 3 weeks. Have you been ill? You look rather pale." "I'll tell you, Madame Malouche, I have been doing the gentleman." "I'll tell you, Madame Malouche, I've been doing the gentleman." Nothing in his life changed except that he went oftener to the pub because he had an idea it was a holiday that he had made the acquaintance of the charitable folk. He returned with his garret rather gay. Stretched on his mattress, he drew over him the sacks borrowed from the chestnut cellar and the corner which served as blankets, and he pondered, well, prison is not so bad. One has everything one wants there, but all the same, one is better at home. His contentment did not last long. He soon perceived that his customers looked at him askance. Fine, sorry, Madame Concho. I don't want anything. What, nothing? Do you live on air then? And Madame Concho, without design to reply, returned to the large bakery of which she was the mistress. The shopkeepers and the caretakers who had once flocked around his barrel, all green and blooming, now turned away from him. Having reached the shoemakers at the sign of l'Angre Gardien, the place where his adventures with the justice had begun, he called, Madame Bayard, you owe me 7 halfpenny from the last time. But Madame Bayard, who was sitting with her counter, did not deign to turn her head. The whole of the Rue Montmartre was aware that Crainquebille had been in prison, and the whole of the Rue Montmartre gave up the acquaintance. The rumor of his conviction had reached the Faubourg and the noisy corner of the Rue Rocher. There, about noon, he received Madame Laurie, a kind of faithful customer, leaning over the barrow of another Constant Langer, young Martin. She was filling a large cabbage. Her hair shone in the sunlight like masses of the golden threads loosely twisted, and young Martin, a nobody, a good-for-nothing, was protesting with his hand on his heart that there were no finer vegetables than his. At the sight, Crainquebille's heart was rent. He pushed his barrow up to young Martin's, and the plaintive broken voice said to Madame Laurie, "It is not fair of you to forsake me." As Madame Laurie herself admitted, she was no duchess. It was not in society that she had acquired her ideas of prison van and the police station, but can one not be honest in every situation of life? Every one has self-respect, and one does not like to deal with a man who has just come out of prison. So the only notice she took of Crainquebille was to give him a look of disgust, and the old costermonger, resenting the affronted, shouted, "Dirty wench, go along with you." Madame Laurie let her cabbage fall and cried, "Ugh, be off with you, you bad penny. You came out of prison and then insult folk." If Crainquebille had had any self-control, he would never have reproached Madame Laurie with her calling. He knew only too well that one is not a master of one's fate, and that one cannot always choose one's occupations, and the good people may be found everywhere. He was accustomed discreetly to ignore her customers' business with her, and he despised no one. But he was beside himself. 3 times he called Madame Laurie drunkard, wench, harridan. A group of idlers gathered around Madame Laurie and Crainquebille. They exchanged a few words, insults as serious as the first, and they would soon have exhausted their vocabulary if a policeman had not suddenly appeared and at once, by the silence and immobility, rendered himself silent and motionless as himself. They separated, but this scene put the finishing touch to the discrediting of Crainquebille in the eyes of Faubourg Montmartre and the Rue Richer. Chapter 7. Results. The old man went along mumbling. For certain, she's a hussy, and no one more of a hussy than she. But at the bottom of his heart, that was not the reproach he brought against her. He did not scorn her for being what she was. Rather, he esteemed her for it, knowing her to be frugal and orderly. Once they had liked to talk to each other. She used to tell him of her parents who lived in the country, and they had both resolved to have a little garden and keep poultry. She was a good customer. And then to see her buying cabbages from young Martin, a dirty, good-for-nothing wretch, it cut him to the heart. And when she pretended to despise him, that put him back up. And then, but she, alas, was not the only one who shunned him, as if she had the plague. Everyone avoided him, just like Madame Laurie, Madame Conchu, the baker, Madame Bayard, Allongue, Gardien, scorned and repulsed him, while the whole society refused to have anything to do with him. So, because one had been put away for a fortnight. One has no good enough even to sell leeks. Was it just? Was it reasonable to make a decent chap die of starvation because he got into difficulties with a copper? If he has not been allowed to sell vegetables, then it is all over for him. Like a badly doctored wine, he turned sour. After having had words with everyone for a mere nothing, he could tell his customers what he thought of them, and in no ambiguous terms, I assure you, if they felt his wares too long, he would call them to their faces, chattering soft heads. Likewise, at the wine shop, he bawled at his comrades. His friend, the chestnutter, that no longer recognized him, old Pierre Crainquebille, had said, and had turned into a regular porcupine. It cannot be denied. He was becoming rude, disagreeable, evil-mouthed, loquacious. The truth of the matter was that he was discovering the imperfections of society, but he had not the facilities of the professor of moral and political science for the expression of his ideas concerning the vices of the system and the reforms necessary, and his thoughts evolved devoid of order and moderation. Misfortune was rendering him unjust. He was taking revenge on those who did not wish him ill, and sometimes on those who were weaker than he. One day he boxed Alphonse, the wine seller's little boy, on the ear because he had asked him what it was like to be sent away. Crainquebille struck him and said, "Dirty brat, it's your father who ought to be sent away instead of growing rich by selling poison." A deed and a speech which did him no honor. For, as the chestnut seller justly remarked, one ought to not strike a child, neither should one reproach him with a father whom he has not chosen. Crainquebille began to drink. The less money he earned, the more brandy he drank. Formerly frugal and sober, he himself marveled at the change. "I never used to be a waster," he said. "I suppose one doesn't improve as one grows old." Sometimes he severely blamed himself for the misconduct and his laziness. "Crainquebille, old chap, you ain't good for nothing but lifting your glass." Sometimes he deceived himself and made out that he needed a drink. "I must have it now and then. I must have a drop to strengthen me and cheer me up. It seems as if I had a fire inside, and there's nothing like the drink for quenching it." It often happened that he missed the auction in the morning, and so had to provide himself with damaged fruit and vegetables on credit. One day, feeling tired and discouraged, he left the barrow in its shed and spent the lifelong day hanging around the stall of Madame Rosé, the tripe seller, or lounging in and out of the wine shops near the market. In the evening, sitting on a basket, he meditated and became conscious of his deterioration. He recalled the strength of his early years, the achievements of former days, the arduous labors and the glad evenings, those days quickly passing, all alike and fully occupied, the passing in the darkness up and down the market pavement, waiting for the early auction, the vegetables carried in armfuls and artistically arranged in the barrow, the piping hot black coffee of Marie Theodore swallowed standing, and at one gulp the shafts grasped vigorously, and then the loud cry, piercing as a cockcrow, rending the morning air as he passed through the crowded streets. All that innocent rough life of the human pack horse came before him. For half a century of his traveling stall he had borne to townsfolk, worn with care and vigil, the fresh harvest of the kitchen gardens. Shaking his head, he sighed. "No, I'm not what I was. I'm done for. The pitcher goes so often to the well that at the last it comes home broken, and when I've never been the same since my affair with the magistrates. No, I'm not the man I was." In short, he was demoralized, and when a man reaches that condition, he might as well be on the ground and unable to rise. All the passer-byers tread him underfoot. Chapter 8. The Final Result. Poverty came, black poverty. The old costermonger, who used to come back from the Faubourg Montmartre with a bag full of 5 franc pieces, had not a single coin now. Winter came. Driven out by his garret, he slept under the carts in a shed. It had been raining for days, the gutters were overflowing, and the shed was flooded. Crouching in his barrow over the pestilent water, in the company of the spiders, rats, and half-starved cats, he was meditating in the gloom, having eaten nothing all day, and no longer having the chestnut seller's sack of covering. He recalled the fortnight when the government had provided him with food and clothing. He envied the prisoners' fate. They suffered neither cold nor hunger, and an idea occurred to him. Since I know the trick, why don't I use it? He rose and went out onto the street. It was a little past 11. The night was dark and chill. The drizzling mist was falling, colder and more penetrating than rain. The few passerbyers crept along under the covers of the houses. Crainquebille went on past the church of Saint Eustache and turned into the Rue Montmartre. It was deserted. A guardian of the peace stood on the pavement by the apse of the church. He was under a gas lamp, and all around fell a fine rain looking reddish in the gas light. It fell on the policeman's hood. He looked chilled to the bone, but either because he preferred to be in the light or because he was tired of walking, he stayed under the lamp, and perhaps it seemed to him a friend, a companion. In the loneliness of the night, the flickering flame was his only entertainment. In the immobility, he appeared hardly human. The reflection of his boots on the wet pavement, which looked like a lake, prolonged him downwards and gave him, from a distance of the air of some amphibious monster half out of the water. Observed more closely, he had at once a monkish and a military appearance. The coarse features of his countenance, magnified under the shadow of his hood, were sad and placid. He wore a thick mustache, short and gray. He was an old copper, a man of some 20 years. Crainquebille went on to him softly, and in the weak, hesitating voice said, "Mort aux vaches." He then awaited the result of those sacred words, but nothing came of them. The constable remained motionless and silent, with his arms folded under his short cloak. His eyes were wide open. They glistened in the darkness and regarded Crainquebille with sadness, vigilance, and scorn. Crainquebille, astonished but still resolute, muttered, "Mort aux vaches, I tell you." There was a long silence in the chill darkness and the falling of the fine penetrating rain. At last the constable spoke. "Such things are not said, for sure and for certain they are not said. At your age, you ought to know better. Pass on." "Why don't you arrest me?" asked Crainquebille. The constable shook his head beneath his dripping hood. "If we were to take up all the addlepats who said that they oughtn't to, we should have our work cut out, and what would be the use of it?" Overcome by such magnanimous disdain, Crainquebille remained for some time stolid and silent, with his feet in the gutter. Before going, he tried to explain. "I didn't mean to say mort aux vaches to you. It was not for you, more for another. It was only an idea." The constable replied sternly but kindly, "Whether an idea or anything else, it ought not to be said, because when a man does his duty and endures much, he ought not to be insulted with idle words. I tell you again to pass on." Crainquebille, with head bent and arms hanging limp, plunged into the rain and darkness. This has been The Majesty of Justice, written by Anatole France, in the book Great Detective Stories, published in 1928, narrated by Conan Stewart for Tales Reawakened on YouTube.